I've been on the most subversive list of the country, and I'm on the most subversive list of Homeland Security till the day. I guess it's a carryover thing. They won't give me my files. I've had a lawyer file for my files, but they said I'm active. Of course, I'm old. I'm not active in anything anymore. I'm Professor James Small. Most people know me as Professor Small. You know, I grew up in South Carolina on a rice plantation called Arcadia, which was a combination of 7 rice plantations that was there during the slavery period of our people. My family was not enslaved on that plantation. They came in the 30s to work. Georgetown has a large African population, and we have multiple villages all around that town that we've had since the days of slavery. They come from the Freewood, which means the maroon community. So we don't know a time when our family were enslaved, because we ran away in the bush. And we stayed in those bushes. That was where the blacks ran away in the thickets, in these forests and these swamps. And that's where my people come out of, the swamps. But they call us the Freewood niggers. You know, that's what white folks call us. But we didn't call ourselves that, but we were the Freewood niggers to them. And so that population, and the population that was only one generation out of Africa, they raised me. And so I'm theirs. But the area where we lived in the area where blacks had lived for hundreds of years during the enslavement process. And the village we lived in was an African village. We did everything they did in Africa the same way. We carried stuff on our heads. And you wouldn't even believe the things those women carried on their heads. We fished. We had a farm. We raised chickens. We raised pigs. We had cows. We milked the cows. We used the same nets they use in Africa. Whenever you go to West Africa and see the big net, we call it seining. We used the same needle to fix the net that they still use in Africa. All of the fundamental principles of Africa was in play. I didn't know it then. When everybody in my community, all the young men and women in the village was 13, we were rounded up and taken into the church. And there was a big meeting. And we had to choose a church father, the men. That's like choosing the African uncle in Africa. And the girls had to choose a church mother. And then for a year, they tutored and trained us. And at the end of the year, we were initiated. Because they didn't call it initiation. They called it going to the mourning bench, where we got on our knees for a period of a week. And they would bring in a preacher from out of town, not your preacher, who could throw down. I mean, straight up had people singing and shouting and jumping over the benches. And during that period, you had to get possessed in order to rise up. And once you got possessed, you know, and while you're on the bench, your family is singing over you, your special song. So each person on that bench family had a song just for them, but it was the rhythm, you know, that went with the song. And I got up like on the 3rd day. And you can't get up and fake it, because there are people that are testing you to make sure you're really possessed, right? And you're dancing and you're singing, and you know. And once you get possessed, you get to sit away from the others until everybody goes in turn, rises up. If you don't rise up, then you have to wait another year. But you lose your place in your age group. And you have to then be in another age group. And no one wanted that. There's such a process that went on throughout West Africa, you know. And when I became initiated as a priest in the Yoruba tradition, I went through the same process as we did on the mourning bench, but we weren't on the mourning bench. You were blindfolded, and you were in the forest, and you were in a hut laying on the ground for a week. And you were fasting, and they're drumming and singing and dancing some days. And you have to get possessed, you know, and you have to have out-of-body experiences where you go on what they call, the Native Americans call dream quest, but you don't know this until you come up out of all of that, and you have to tell the elder priests around you what you saw, who you talked to, what you spoke about. And then at the end of the 7-day process, when the blindfold came off, and you were taken to the water and bathed in the sea, and put on your white clothing, And after you'd been washed down thoroughly, because you're not bathing or nothing for 7 days in that sun, you know you need a serious washing down, right? And so I said, wow, all those things we were doing on Acadia, these were the African things. And these people behave as an African village. We call everybody ka or cousin, even though they weren't our blood relatives. We operated like this one big, huge family, and still do, even though we've all left there now. And so that's why I reference an African village, because when I go to Africa, I see the same behavior, the same actions, the same attitudes that I experienced as a child on Acadia. I'm from the Chicora Nation and a part of the Wakamo Nation. They're part of the larger Tuscarora Nation and Southern Iroquois Nation. Most of the Southern Iroquois would migrate north and become a part of the Northern Iroquois Confederation. But many of those who stayed south are now a part of the Cherokee Greater Nation in the mountains of North Carolina. Even though the Cherokee leadership today act more like they're white folks than indigenous people. No disrespect, but truth is the light, because my family went there at the invitation of brothers and sisters who were Cherokee, who were part of our family, to have a family reunion about 8 years ago, and our initial reception was very negative until I stormed the powwow the next day. And the apology is that they didn't understand or knew why we were there, because much of the people they call Cherokee are not Cherokee at all. They're part of a multiple group of nations that live in North Carolina, South Carolina, northern Georgia, that the white men just dump all of us on that reservation up in North Carolina. People tell us we had lost everything and forgotten everything, and I realize we haven't lost or forgotten most of what we brought to America. We just put different clothing on it and hid it in different places, and now we can't find some of it, and we don't recognize the garments we put them in. But once you start going to Africa, everything becomes clear. It's like a mirror. They have different names they call us for the Africans who lived in Venezuela and Argentina, where we know we live all over. But somebody else came and called us Indians. We're just the people. We're the humans you found when you got here. My mother's mother, Susan, her name was Hope. And she married my great-grandfather, Pajo, who came from Uganda. But he was Tutsi. When he was 16, he was already almost 7 feet. So he escapes from the plantation in Virginia. And with his mom and his brother walked back to Georgetown, South Carolina, where they were sold, thinking they could make their way back home. But she was a traditional priestess, because her father was a traditional priest. They call them root people down there. So my grandmother was the root lady for our village, and much of that area, everybody came to her, even white people. And a root person is really a physician, a herbalist, a spiritual visionary, someone who can read your spirit and so forth. But mostly they came for the herb and the medicine when people were sick. And she delivered something like 40-something babies in her lifetime. She was also a midwife. And so that's who raised me primarily. Our parents was in the house, but when you live in an African village, the parents don't have that authority over you. The grandparents have the authority over you to rear you, you know. And then I had an uncle, Uncle Snowy, that's my mother's brother. He had more authority over me than my father did. And that too is clearly African. The mother's brother is the one in charge of raising the mother's boy children, even though the father's still there fathering. And so I had that kind of upbringing. And when I started going to Africa, I go like, oh my God, I've been in Africa all of my life. Most of it was the same. The indigenous people of this country, well, I don't want to call them indigenous, that's the wrong word, because Africans were here before the Asiatic got here. The reason they're red and not yellow anymore is because of the amalgamation between the African black and the Asian yellow. That's what produced the red man. So we got to get that straight. And then, but like on the East Coast, a lot of the indigenous Africans were still there. I mean, anybody can look at me and tell and know that I'm one of them. But the whites raided our village, burnt our camps, and enslaved all of us. That they all look like Africans anyway, so let's just put them all in slavery. My papa, Andrew Small, was the head of the Freemasons and the Oddfellows at the same time. Mama was Eastern Star, and she was Daughters of Isis at the same time. And this is my grandparents. And my parents came north and they became a part of the workers' movement, the union movement. You know, that's who introduced me to Malcolm and being in the struggle. My mom and dad lived in New York because they went there, to, of course, like most Southerners, to make money to take care of their children and family. And when I was 16 years old, I saw a man on television standing up for black people, and his name was Malcolm X. So I called my mother and said, I want to meet this man. So she came to South Carolina for the summer and brought me back to New York in the summer of '63. And I had an opportunity to meet for about 15 minutes El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, Malcolm X, on 147th Street and 8th Avenue in front of the Food Family Supermarket where I was packing groceries at the time. And the one thing he told me was, stay in school, get an education. Education was going to be key in freeing our people, and I've tried to live true to that. I would later go back to South Carolina, thought I was Malcolm X, got into a lot of trouble. We were picketing the lunch counters in Georgetown and the theaters. And our grandparents were stronger than we were. They didn't want us picketing the theaters. And I remember not understanding at first, because I lived in the countryside. And so you had the country blacks and you had the city black. But I went to high school in the city. The country blacks didn't want to beg whites to be a part of their world. So I come out of that, this fighting black, free black community of people. My grandfather, Andrew, was also a part of the Moorish Science Temple. You know, I still have his pen. And so I come out of that house where Mama is his wife is the root lady, and he's the political leader, and the Masons and the Moors. And so that's what I am. That's the house I come out of. And so I'm involved in the picketing and the demonstratings in high school. I'm a teenager with all of this going on. So when I get in the Navy, I find that the same racism is there. So I hooked up with some brothers from home and some others, and we formed something called the Splib Brotherhood. And that black brotherhood, which covered a whole fleet, we must have had something like about 20 ships where we were organized, the blacks were organized. And that was true throughout the military, especially in the 60s. And I was a part of the Blood Brotherhood. We were on Guantanamo Bay, and we walked into the enlisted man club. No women is there, this is all men. And somebody accidentally hit the hot dog out of the hand of a young white man, one of our group, about 8 of us. And Jimmy immediately offered to pay him and apologize. And the young man was amiable to that. Some hand came out of nowhere and slapped the money out of Jimmy's hand and said, don't take that nigga's money. Well, that person ended up dead when all was said and done. And the fight, you know, that had to ensue in an instant, he lasted like about 2 weeks in the hospital. And so from that point on, we were all like targets of our own military people. And some of us went to jail, I didn't. Jimmy got out, I got out. They would arrest you for small things and give you maximum time. When I first went in the military, I volunteered to go to Vietnam. I was a 17-year-old kid. I thought this was real. But by the time I get to 20 years old, I'm saying, no, that ain't happening. And they told me, you have orders, you'll be forced to go. So I retorted that if I'm forced to go, the ship won't reach port. So I got court-martialed for that. I lost, but I got a minimal punishment because the captain was very close to me. I was the librarian. And so he had nobody he could talk to, and I'm isolated in the library to keep me from the general population and teaching, because I did this kind of talking back then at 18 years old. Him and I had a rapport that he didn't have with others. So he gave me a very light punishment and transferred me to another ship. I left the U.S. Navy. I owed them 2 years of reserve time. I refused to do that reserve time. I never served the 2 years, and they gave me an honorable discharge. I showed up at my court-martial that morning wearing a black beret, black leather jacket, black turtleneck shirt, a bandana, a bullet across my chest like the Mexican soldiers wore, a 25 Beretta on my hip, and black combat boots, combat pants. And they said, you can't go in the courtroom like that. I said, well, that's all I got, right? 3 years later, I got an honorable discharge through the mail. And I never served that time. But from that moment till now, I've been on the most subversive list of the country, and I'm on the most subversive list of Homeland Security till the day. I guess it's a carryover thing. They won't give me my files. I've had a lawyer file for my files, but they said I'm active. Of course, I'm old. I'm not active in anything anymore. So that's what I come out of before I end up, you know. And of course, in the period of all of that, I go to Mecca and become al-Hajj Amin Shaheed. And somewhere in there, I break away from all of that to a degree and go back to college, go to City College. Malcolm was killed while I was in the Navy. I returned home a few months later, went to his sister Ella, who is now the president of the OAAU, Organization of Afro-American Unity. I joined the organization. In a few weeks, I was chosen as her personal security. In a few months, I was elected as the imam of the Muslim Mosque, Inc. And in a few years after that, I became al-Hajj Amin Shaheed, having made my pilgrimage to Mecca. This is all before I go to City College to get into this whole professor thing. During that period of time, I worked with, of course, the Black Panther Party, the Black Liberation Army. I was a member of SNCC, member of NAACP. During the 60s, early 70s, I was the liaison between the Black Panther Party and the OAAU. At the same time, I was Malcolm's sister's bodyguard. So I was in constant contact with Lumumba Shakur, who was the head of the Black Panther Party in Harlem. His brother Zaid Shakur, the husband of Assata Shakur, was the head of Black Panther Party in the Bronx. Zaid and I was much closer, because we were close in age. Matula Shakur, the youngest brother, the purported leader of the Black Liberation Army, who was at Lincoln Hospital running a detox program using acupuncture for brothers and sisters who was hooked on heroin. So that was the world I was in, and this is the time of the formation of the Black Panther Party, the Black Liberation Army. I was a part of the group that opened the first breakfast program for the Black Panther Party in New York City, and I opened the second breakfast program on 125th Street for the OAU. I've met so many kings and so many queens. Afeni Shakur. You know, Tupac was a very good friend of my kids. And there was one of my children that he was very fond of, who was very fond of him. I didn't actually like Tupac very much in the beginning, even though I know his mom and know his dad, everything. But he was a good guy. And he did, you know, like I said, very close to my kids. The day before he was killed, he called and wanted to set up a meeting with me when he got back to New York the next week. He called from Vegas. The meeting was about him. He was telling me that him and Biggie was really not fighting each other. That this was the magazines, this was the news people, this was their enemy that has created this whole thing. And the main reason that it was being pushed so hard is because Tupac, he said him and Biggie had got together and they'd come up with a way to take over distribution of rap music. And I told him then, I says, you know, that can get you killed. You're dealing with this mafia and the mafia, both. And he said, we know, we understand, but I told him, you and Biggie can't pull this off by yourself. And he said, no, we're meeting with other rappers, and we have a lot of other rappers on board. And he said, so Professor Small, when I get back in New York next week, I'm gonna be at the fight tomorrow night. Get back in New York next week, I'm coming over to the house, we're gonna talk. And I said, cool. And I handed the phone back to my daughter. And we would hear the next day that he was shot to death, you know, after that fight. But he was very clear. And it didn't end with Tupac. Right after Tupac got shot, you remember there was 2 rappers that got killed in Jersey also. They were a part of the group with him and Biggie. Then of course Biggie would be killed later. But this all had to do with distribution, because who was the brother that brought out the fact that Columbia Record had Harvard University do a study for them back in the early 60s, the late 50s, on how do you get control of the music industry without giving these people draconian contracts and da-da-da-da-da, and then you always have to fight them, some of them even killed. They kept a lot of us on dope to manage us and so forth. And the Harvard study, which is called the Columbia Record Study, says if you control distribution, you control the industry. You see? So it doesn't matter, let them own the masters, let them own the labels. You control the distribution of the product. And the big boys, you know that thing, you want to bombard, you want to be with the big boys, but they step up and says, if you don't do this, then your stuff will not leave the warehouse. We'll fulfill our contract, we'll record you, we'll even put you on the tours, but your stuff ain't gonna sell, and that's where the money's at. Because that draconian industry that used us with our music wanted to direct the course of our culture. And when those black men said that ain't happening, I've been lecturing for 50 years. You know, of course, I was very close with Dr. Ben, extraordinarily close with Dr. Clark, close to Brother Asa Hilliard, Brother Jake Carruthers, Dr. Francis Welsing. I met Francis in 1967, Dr. Welsing, at the Black Power Conference in New Jersey. You know, because she didn't just come up being Dr. Welsing. She was an activist in the movement. She was trying to get people to go and raid the jail and break a Mary Baraka out of jail that day. Y'all are men, y'all are going, get him out of jail, go break down the doors. I come out of the struggle in that way. We were the voice of the Black Liberation Army above ground. Proud of it, never been afraid to say it, ain't scared of nobody about it. But I always tried to be that kind of a low-key guy that always make myself look like I'm the security guy standing in the corner. And that has worked most of my life. So most people know very little about what my background in life was. I'd been in college twice and dropped out for the movement. And this time I meet a man named Professor Leonard Jeffries, who became my mentor on African history, his wife on African culture, Dr. Rosalind Jeffries, and we've been friends for 50 years. At City College, I was an administrator full-time, and I was a professor part-time. I was an adjunct lecturer who carried a professor's load, meaning I taught 3 courses instead of 1, so they had to give me a professor's title, which they really didn't want to do because I only had a bachelor's degree. I would get a doctorate degree after I leave City College. My full-time position was as the general manager of the student union, which means I control the theater, conference room, ballrooms, rec rooms, cafeterias, anything that affected student lives. Because as a student, I told the president, you can't speak to anybody except me and my people. So you can't even speak to black faculty. So black faculty had to make me their vice president. I know that was a little arrogant, you know, but that's what I did, and it worked. I had more money, $2 million in my budget, more than the president, and I had a staff of 60 people, more than the president. And we ushered in the Black Studies Department, which I'm proud to say I'm one of the persons that was the author of that process, and one of the technocrats that saw its implementation with Harold Cruz and Dr. Charles Hamilton from Columbia University. And we brought Dr. Leonard Jeffries to lead that department up by 1972. The rest is history. Then you know me from the ASCAC group, from the AHSA group, from Black Studies with Dr. Leonard Jeffries, from Out of Darkness, and here I am, Professor James Small.